The thing about digging is that you never really know what's listening from below. My great-grandfather Silas Webb learned this the hard way in the fall of 1901, and what happened to him in those Kentucky hills has haunted my family for 4 generations. I'm telling this story now because I think people need to understand something fundamental about the Appalachian Mountains. They're old in ways that make human civilization look like a brief flicker, and some parts of them have never really belonged to us at all. This isn't some polished ghost story your grandmother tells at Christmas. This is documented fact, stitched together from Silas's own journal entries, county records, newspaper clippings, and the testimonies of people who were there. I've spent 15 years researching what happened on that property, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that my great-grandfather did dig a well in Breathitt County in 1901. I can also tell you with equal certainty that something did dig back, and it's still there. Silas Webb was 28 years old when he bought 40 acres of supposedly cursed land for almost nothing. The property sat in a hollow called Sawyer's Gap, about 8 miles from the nearest town of Jackson. The locals had a saying about that hollow: "The gap takes what the gap wants," which should have been his first warning. But Silas was educated, practical, and thoroughly convinced that Appalachian superstition was just ignorance dressed up in folklore. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. The land had been abandoned for 6 years after the previous owner, a tanner named Dutch Sawyer, disappeared without a trace. His wife claimed he'd been taken by the hollow, which the authorities interpreted as either murder or desertion. Either way, Sawyer's property went to auction, and Silas snapped it up with money he'd saved from 3 years working as a school teacher in Lexington. Here's what I want you to understand about my great-grandfather. He wasn't some illiterate hillbilly jumping at shadows. He'd attended 2 years of college, could read Latin, and kept meticulous records of everything. His journal entries from those first weeks are full of practical observations about soil quality, timber density, and optimal locations for outbuildings. There's not a hint of unease anywhere. The first entry that matters is dated September 3rd, 1901. The land is good, despite local superstitions. The previous owner's cabin requires significant repair, but the foundation is sound. Only concern is water. The nearby creek runs foul this time of year. We'll need to dig a well before winter. Several excellent locations identified. That last line, makes my skin crawl. Silas chose a spot about 30 yards from the cabin, where the dowsing rods indicated strong water presence. Dowsing is another one of those Appalachian traditions that educated people used to mock, but it works more often than it doesn't. The water witcher he hired was an old Cherokee woman named Mary Sixkiller, and according to Silas's notes, she refused to take payment after testing the ground. She became agitated when the rods crossed at my chosen location, Silas wrote. Said the water there has something in it, and repeatedly urged me to dig elsewhere. When I pressed her to explain, she would only say that some hollows have a bottom place and that I should fill any hole I dig at the first sign of wrong dirt. I confess I found her behavior puzzling and somewhat theatrical. The woman is nearly 70 and likely prone to the superstitious fancies common among her generation. This is the part where I need to address something important. My great-grandfather's dismissive attitude toward Mary Sixkiller's warning is a perfect example of the dangerous arrogance that educated outsiders often brought to Appalachia. The people who lived in those mountains for generations, whether they were Cherokee, Scots, Irish, or any of the other groups who made the region home, had accumulated genuine knowledge about the land and its peculiarities. Dismissing that knowledge as superstition wasn't enlightened rationalism. It was stupidity. Mary Sixkiller knew something was wrong with that ground. Silas should have listened. He started digging on September 7th, 1901. The first day's work went normally. He got down about 6 feet through typical mountain soil, mostly clay and rocks. His journal entry that evening is unremarkable except for one detail. The 3E work is harder than anticipated. The earth seems to resist the shovel in a peculiar way, as if packed with unusual density. Strange, given that the soil appears loose when examined by hand. The second day, things started getting weird. Reached approximately 9 feet by late afternoon, Silas wrote on September 8th. The soil has changed character entirely. Instead of the expected increase in moisture as I descend toward the water table, the earth is becoming drier and more compacted. Color has shifted from the reddish-brown clay typical of the region to something closer to dark gray, almost black. The smell is also unusual, not unpleasant, but mineral-rich, like the air before a thunderstorm. That night, Silas was awakened by what he described as rhythmic sounds coming from the direction of the well. He investigated with a lantern and found nothing, but noted that the sounds seemed to emanate from within the well itself, though I can conceive of no natural explanation. Perhaps settling earth or some small animal that has fallen in. Here's what's crucial. Silas wasn't prone to flights of fancy, but he was honest enough to record things that puzzled him. Over the next 3 days, his journal entries document an increasingly strange situation. September 9th, 12 feet down. The gray soil continues, now shot through with what appears to be a white, crystalline substance. I sent a sample to my former professor at the university for analysis. The nighttime sounds have continued, growing somewhat louder. They maintain a peculiar rhythm: 3 taps, then silence, then 3 more taps, almost like the entry stops there. The next line is crossed out so heavily that I've never been able to read what it originally said. September 10th, 15 feet. I shall have reached water by now, according to both the dowsing and the typical depth of wells in this region. Instead, I've encountered a layer of the same white crystalline substance, now so thick that it slows progress considerably. The material is extremely hard but shatters like glass when struck with sufficient force. Fragments are translucent, with an odd property of seeming to glow faintly in darkness. Though this is likely a trick of the eye, the tapping sounds have changed. Now it's a pattern. Tap, 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 tap. The same sequence repeats endlessly. September 11th. I have made a discovery that defies ready explanation. At approximately 18 feet, the white crystalline layer gave way suddenly, and my shovel broke through into what I can only describe as a cavity. I lowered a lantern on a rope and observed that I had breached the ceiling of what appears to be a much larger space below. The cavity extends beyond the light of my lantern in all directions. More disturbing, the tapping sounds immediately ceased when I broke through. The silence is somehow worse. Also concerning, the temperature drops significantly when I lean over the well. Cold air rises from below, carrying that same mineral smell, now stronger and mixed with something else, something organic and unfamiliar. He should have stopped. Any reasonable person would have stopped. But Silas Webb was consumed by curiosity, that peculiarly dangerous kind of curiosity educated people sometimes mistake for scientific inquiry. On September 12th, he widened the well opening and constructed a rope ladder to descend into the cavity. His journal entry from that evening is long, detailed, and increasingly frantic. I am writing this by lamplight, my hands still trembling from what I have witnessed. I descended approximately 25 feet below the breakthrough point, finding myself in a cavern of considerable size, perhaps 40 feet across, with a ceiling height of 30 feet where I entered. But this is no natural cave formation. The walls are too regular, too smooth. They curve in a way that suggests intentional architecture, though who or what could have constructed such a thing at this depth is beyond my comprehension. The white crystalline substance covers every surface, growing in formations that resemble nothing so much as enormous teeth or bones. In the lamplight, they cast shadows that seem to move independently of the light source, though again, this is likely a perceptual error caused by the disorienting environment. But here is what truly shakes me. Carved into the crystalline walls are symbols, not Native American petroglyphs, W. Thailand, which I have studied. Not any language or script I recognize from my classical education. These markings are elaborate, deeply incised, and they cover the walls in spiraling patterns that draw the eye downward toward the center of the cavern floor. And at that center is a hole. Another hole. Descending further down, much wider than my well, perhaps 15 feet across. I could not bring myself to approach the edge for reasons I cannot fully articulate. The cold air rises from this central shaft with such force that it extinguished my lantern twice. When I relit it and held it near the opening, I observed something that has left me deeply unsettled. The flame bent downward, toward the hole, as if drawn by some force stronger than the updraft of cold air. This is where Silas made his critical mistake. Instead of filling in the well and leaving that hollow forever, he became obsessed with understanding what he'd found. Over the next week, he made detailed sketches of the symbols, took measurements of the cavern, and attempted to translate the markings using every reference book he owned. He also started having visitors. The first was his nearest neighbor, a man named Tobias Guthrie, who lived about 2 miles away. Guthrie appeared at Silas's cabin on September 15th, looking haggard and fearful, according to the journal. Guthrie demanded to know what I had done, Silas wrote. He claimed that for the past 3 nights, everyone within 5 miles has heard sounds deep resonant drumming that seems to come from underground. His livestock are terrified. His children won't sleep. He accused me of opening what should stay shut and insisted I fill in the well immediately. When I attempted to discuss the matter rationally, explaining my archaeological discovery, he became hostile and left, saying I had doomed us all and that he was taking his family to stay with relatives in Virginia until I fixed what I'd done. True to his word, Guthrie abandoned his property within 2 days. So did 3 other families in the surrounding area. The exodus was documented in Jackson County newspaper on September 20th. Mysterious underground sounds caused panic for families flee Sawyer's Gap. But Silas stayed, and he continued his research. His journal entries from this period reveal a man sliding from scientific curiosity into something darker, an obsession that blinded him to growing evidence that he'd disturbed something that should have remained undisturbed. September 18th. The sounds have indeed grown louder and more complex. They no longer seem to come from my well, but from the ground itself, as if the entire hollow is resonating like the skin of a drum. The pattern has evolved into something almost rhythmic, almost musical, though no music I've ever heard. I've attempted to transcribe it using musical notation, but the tones don't correspond to any scale I know. I have begun to suspect the sounds might be a form of communication. September 2nd. A breakthrough in translating the symbols. If my analysis is correct, and I believe it is, the spiral patterns are not language in the conventional sense, but rather a kind of map or diagram. They seem to indicate depth, with each spiral representing a descending level or layer. If I'm reading correctly, the cavity I discovered is merely the uppermost level of a structure that extends down for. No, that cannot be right. My calculations suggest a depth of over 3 miles. Impossible. I must have made an error. September 22nd. I have not slept in 36 hours. The sounds are constant now, and I have become convinced they are indeed communication, but not directed at me. It's as if my intrusion has awakened something that is now calling out, and something else is answering from deep below. The sounds from above from my level are higher pitched, almost frantic. The responses from below are slower, deeper, resonant with what I can only describe as vast patience. More disturbing, I have begun to find my tools rearranged each morning. The rope ladder I installed in the well is sometimes moved, not removed, but repositioned, as if someone has been climbing up or down. Yet, I am alone here, completely alone. He wasn't alone. That's the thing that still makes me check my closets before bed, even though I live 800 miles from that hollow and nothing has followed me. Silas wasn't alone, and on some level, he knew it. September 24th. I must record what happened at last night, though I scarcely believe it myself. I was awakened around 2 a.m. by a sound different from the drumming, a scraping, dragging sound, as if something large was being pulled across the ground outside my cabin. I took my rifle and lantern and investigated. The well. Something had emerged. From the well, I could see the marks clearly in the dirt, a trail leading from the well opening toward the tree line, approximately 20 feet wide. Not footprints. The earth was disturbed as if scraped or swept, with deep gouges every few feet. Whatever made this trail was heavy enough to compress the ground significantly. But here's what truly terrified me. The trail didn't lead away into the forest. It circled my cabin. 3 complete circles, each one slightly closer than the last, spiraling inward. The innermost circle came within 5 feet of my door, and then the trail led back back down. Whatever came up last night also went back down. But the implication is clear. It knows I'm here. It's aware of me, and it chose not to. I cannot finish this thought. This is the part of the story where I need to talk about something uncomfortable. Reading Silas's journal, now with the benefit of more than a century of perspective, it's clear he was experiencing a psychological breakdown. The isolation, the obsession, the lack of sleep. These are textbook conditions for someone losing their grip on reality. A modern psychologist would probably diagnose him with acute paranoia, or even the early stages of psychosis. But here's the problem with that neat, rational explanation. Other people witnessed what was happening. Multiple witnesses, including the county sheriff, a newspaper reporter, and eventually a geologist from the University of Kentucky. What happened at Sawyer's Gap in the fall of 1901 wasn't just one man's delusion. It was a documented incident that the authorities tried very hard to suppress afterward. The first outside witness was Sheriff Coleman Watts, who visited the property on September 26 after receiving reports of the underground NES. His official report, which I found in the county archives, is professionally detached but clearly unsettled. Responded to complaints regarding disturbances at the Webb property, Sawyer's Gap. Found Mr. Webb in a state of agitation but coherent. He showed me a well he'd been excavating, which he claims has breached into a large underground cavity. The well appears sound in construction, though unusually deep. I did observe unusual acoustic phenomena, low-frequency sounds that appear to emanate from underground, consistent with reports from former residents of the area. Recommended Mr. Webb consult with a mining engineer regarding possible subsidence or underground voids. Advised him to cease excavation until the structural integrity of the ground can be assessed. Mr. Webb agreed to this recommendation, but in his personal diary, which his grandson donated to the County Historical Society in 1967, Sheriff Watts was more forthcoming. Something's wrong at that hollow. Dead wrong. The sounds aren't natural. I've heard enough rock falls and mine collapses to know what shifting earth sounds like, and this ain't it. This is rhythmic, patterned, almost like drums or something beating on the inside of the earth, and the cold. Sweet Jesus, the cold coming up out of that well. Middle of September, must have been 70 degrees out, and the air coming out of that hole was cold enough to make my breath fog. But what really got to me was the marks around the cabin. Webb tried to play him off as bear tracks, but I've tracked bear all my life. No bear made those marks. Nothing I've ever seen made those marks. Too wide, too regular, and the pattern don't make sense. Why would any animal circle a cabin 3 times and then leave? I told Webb to fill in that damn well, but I could. And his eyes, he won't do it. He's got that look people get when they're fixed on something, when they've gone past common sense into pure obsession. I've seen it before, mostly in men who've been alone in the mountains too long. Usually ends bad. Sheriff Watts tried to legally compel Silas to fill L in the well, but there was no law on the books that covered the situation. You couldn't force a man to fill in his own well on his own property just because it made people nervous. So the sheriff did the only thing he could. He spread the word that people should avoid Sawyer's Gap until the matter was resolved. This is when the newspaper got involved. The Jackson County Eagle sent a reporter named Frederick Marsh to investigate on September 29th. Marsh's article, published on October 1st under the headline, Scientific Mystery or Mountain Madness, Local Man Claims to Have Discovered Ancient Underground Structure, is a masterpiece of early 20th century journalism trying to maintain objectivity about something genuinely inexplicable. This reporter visited the Webb property on Thursday last, expecting to find either an elaborate hoax or a simple misunderstanding of natural geological faux. Instead, I must report findings that challenge both explanations. Mr. Webb, a former educator of good reputation, has indeed excavated a well of unusual depth, approximately 20 feet, before breaking through into a large underground cavity. At Mr. Webb's invitation, I descended into his cavity using a rope ladder of his construction. I must confess that what I observed defies easy explanation. The cavity is far too regular to be a natural cave formation. The walls are smooth and curved in a way that suggests intentional shaping. The white crystalline substance coating the surface is unlike any mineral I've encountered, and the symbols carved into the walls are certainly not Native American in origin, nor do they resemble any writing system in my limited knowledge. Most puzzling are the acoustic properties of the space. Sounds echo in unusual ways, and there is indeed a persistent low-frequency vibration that can be felt through the floor of the cavern. Mr. Webb's theory that this represents some form of pre-Columbian construction is fascinating but unsupported by any known archaeology of the region. However, I must also report that Mr. Webb appears to be under considerable strain. He spoke repeatedly of communications from below, and showed me elaborate charts and calculations regarding the supposed depth and extent of the underground structure. When I suggested that the sounds might have a natural explanation, underground rivers, settling rock, or even his own excavation having destabilized nearby geological formations, he became agitated and accused me of willful blindness. This reporter's opinion, Mr. Webb has likely discovered an unusual natural formation that has, unfortunately, captured his imagination to an unhealthy degree. The true mystery may not be what lies beneath Sawyer's Gap, but rather what drives an educated man to abandon reason in favor of fantastical speculation. I've read this article dozens of times, and what strikes me most is what Marsh doesn't say. He doesn't mention staying overnight. He doesn't describe the sounds in detail. And he never wrote about the subject again, despite it being the most unusual story of his career. When my research led me to his great-niece in 1998, she told me something interesting. Frederick Marsh left Jackson County less than a month after this article was published and refused to ever discuss the Webb case. When she asked him about it as a child in the 1940s, he told her, "Some things seem curious in daylight but show their true face in darkness." I was smart enough to leave before dark, but Silas stayed. Even after the university geologist visited on October 3rd and confirmed that the underground cavity was anomalous and recommended the well be sealed as a precautionary measure, Silas refused to fill it in. Instead, he went deeper. His journal entry from October 5th documents what I consider the point of no return. I have decided to explore the central shaft, the larger opening at the center of the first cavity. Every rational voice in my head tells me this is foolish, potentially suicidal. I have no proper equipment for such a descent, no partners to assist in case of emergency, and no clear idea of what I might find below. Yet I cannot stop myself. Sounds have changed again. They are no longer drumming or tapping. They have become something closer to music? No, that's not quite right. They are too structured to be natural, but too alien to be music as we understand it. It's as if the earth itself is singing, and the song is both beautiful and terrible. I have constructed a simple rope pulley system using the sturdy oak near my cabin. Tomorrow I will descend into the central shaft and document whatever I find. If I do not return, this journal should serve as a record of my discoveries. To whomever finds this, I believe I have stumbled upon something of immense archaeological and scientific importance. Whether it is the remnant of some unknown pre-Columbian civilization or something else entirely, it deserves proper study. Do not make the mistake of dismissing this as the ravings of a madman. I am not mad. I am simply the first to see what has been hidden beneath these mountains for an immeasurable time, and it wants to be seen. I am certain of this now. The sounds are not warnings, they are invitations. This is where Silas's regular journal entries end. What follows is a series of fragmentary notes, some dated, some n-ote, many written in a hand that becomes increasingly erratic. I've organized them chronologically as best I can, but the timeline becomes uncertain. October 6th. Descended 40 feet below the first cavity floor. The central shaft is perfectly circular, 20 feet in diameter. The walls are end with the crystalline substance, arranged in a spiral pattern that draws the eye ever downward. At this depth, the symbols on the walls have changed. They are more elaborate, more dense. I have the uncanny sensation that they are not merely decorative but functional, that they serve some purpose. I cannot yet comprehend. The temperature continues to drop as I descend. I can see my breath even though it's nearly 70 degrees of the surface. The sounds are louder here, more directional. They come from below, always from below. Undated, lost count of depth. 60 feet, 80. They rope-haw. Developed ice crystals where it passes through the upper cavity impossible given the temperature at the surface, but undeniable. My lantern casts shadows that move wrong. I know this sounds insane, but I swear the shadows slide along the walls independent of the light source, as if they are cast by why objects I cannot see. Ascending for supplies and rest will continue tomorrow. October 8th. I have begun to understand the purpose of the symbols. They are not language, they are instructions, directions perhaps, or warnings. I cannot yet read them, but I can feel their intent. Each spiral level corresponds to a specific depth, and the symbols at each level describe what lies below. The message is consistent: deeper, come deeper, witness and understand. I am beginning to suspect that this structure was not built to keep something in. It was built to guide something down, or to guide someone down to find what waits at the bottom. Undated, 100 feet, possibly more. I have passed through 3 more cavity levels, each larger than the last. The architecture becomes more elaborate as I descend. The walls are carved with reliefs that depict, I don't have words for what depict, forms that are neither human nor animal, geometries that hurt to look at, and at this depth, I've found the first evidence of habitation, or occupation, or I don't know what to call it. Niches carved into the walls, sized for bodies much larger than human. Altars perhaps, though for what kind of worship I cannot imagine, and the sounds have resolved into something almost comprehensible. I can hear distinct voices within them, if voices is the right word. They rise and fall in patterns that suggest conversation. I have the terrible feeling that they are discussing me. This is where I need to pause and address something that troubles me deeply about this case. Reading Silas's descriptions of what he found, it's tempting to dismiss everything as hallucination, the product of hypothermia, oxygen deprivation, or simple madness. That would be the comfortable conclusion. But physical evidence suggests otherwise. When Silas's property was finally searched by authorities in late October 1901, they found the well exactly as he described it. They found the rope and pulley system, They found his camping supplies arranged in the first cavity as if he'd been living down there for days. And they found something Silas never mentioned in his journal. Marks on the crystalline walls of the upper cavity that appeared to be recent scraping and scratching that had removed some of the symbols, as if something had been trying to erase them, or perhaps frantically searching for something specific among the carvings. The authorities also found Silas's measurement stakes driven into the cavern floor, marking his descent into the central shaft. The deepest stake they found was at 127 feet below the first cavity floor, 147 feet below the original ground surface. The rope continued, down past that point into darkness, but the search party refused to descend further after one of them suffered what the report called a severe nervous episode characterized by uncontrolled trembling and claims of hearing voices from below. What they never found was Silas himself. He simply vanished sometime between October 8th and October 11th, when a passing traveler noticed his livestock were distressed and reported it to the sheriff. But before he disappeared, Silas wrote one final journal entry. It wasn't in his regular journal. It was written on loose papers found scattered around his cabin, the handwriting barely legible. October 10th, 1901. I have reached the bottom. God help me, I have reached the bottom. And it was not the bottom at all. It was a door. 217 feet down. I counted every foot, every agonizing foot of that descent, in absolute darkness, because my lantern oil ran out at 160 feet, and I continued anyway, because I had to know. I had to know. The central shaft terminates in another cavity, but this one is different from all the others. It's not a natural formation, and it's not built it's grown. The walls pulse with rhythm. I can feel through my boots. The crystalline substance here is not white, but faintly luminescent blue-green, casting enough light to see by. And the sound at this depth is overwhelming, vibrating through my bones, resonating in my skull, until I cannot tell where the sound ends and my thoughts begin. At the center of this final cavity is a structure. No, that's the wrong word. At the center is an opening. A wound in the earth itself, perfectly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, and from it rises air so cold it burns my lungs. But it's not just air, it's something thicker, omething that moves with purpose, that reaches out like invisible fingers to touch and probe and test. And I understand now. Finally, I understand. This place was not built by humans. It was not built for humans. We are not the first things to think and build and create on this planet. We are not even the second or third. We are simply the latest, the most recent, the current tenants of a house that has had many occupants before us, and some of those previous tenants never fully left. They retreated into the deep places, the hollow places, the spaces between rock and water where time moves differently and where patience is measured in epochs. The symbols on the walls, I can read them now, though I wish I could not. They tell a story of descent and waiting, of things that burrowed down when the surface world became inhospitable, when their time was ending and ours was beginning. They went below, and they waited, and they built these structures as a kind of, architecture? Warning? Invitation? All three, perhaps, because the final message, the one carved largest and deepest at this level, is unmistakable even to my imperfect translation. We are still here. We have always been here. We are patient. We are vast. We dig deep and we dig slow, and we remember when this land was ours, and we dream of when it will be ours again. I can see them now. Movement in the central opening. Not coming up, not yet, but rising and falling like something breathing. Testing the air. Testing the way. I opened this. I gave them a path. The well I dug reached down to them, and now they have dug up to meet me. The locals were right. Dutch Sawyer knew. The Cherokee knew. Everyone who lived in this hollow knew, on some deep instinctive level, that there are places you don't dig and depth, niches you don't reach, and things that should stay buried. I have made a terrible mistake. I cannot undo it. The opening is here now. The path is established, and I do not think I will be permitted to seal it again. They are coming up to inspect their new doorway. They are. The entry ends there. Mid-sentence. The papers torn, as if ripped from a notebook in haste. There are stains on it that were never identified, though the police report notes they were oily and faintly luminescent under lantern light. Silas Webb was never seen again. The authorities' response to his disappearance tells you everything about how seriously they took the situation. Sheriff Watts organized an immediate search party, but he also did something unusual. He contacted the state militia and requested their assistance in sealing a hazardous opening on private property. Within 3 days, a unit of the Kentu Cape Tupete National Guard arrived in Sawyer's Gap with wagon loads of materials. The official report states they filled in the well with rocks, gravel, and concrete, sealing it completely. Unofficially, and I have this from letters written by one of the soldiers to his sister, they did much more than that. They collapsed the first cavity with dynamite, then filled the entire shaft with a mixture of concrete and crushed rock, layer by layer, until the original ground surface was restored. They worked around the clock for 4 days straight, and several of the men reported becoming ill with symptoms described as extreme anxiety and auditory hallucinations. One soldier, Private James Lockwood, was hospitalized after claiming he could hear screaming from underground, even after the well was sealed. He was discharged from service a month later on psychological grounds. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night: sealing the well didn't stop the sounds. According to newspaper accounts from November 1901, residents within a 5-mile radius continued to report underground vibrations and noises for weeks after the well was filled. The sounds gradually diminished over the course of that year, but they never completely stopped. And every few decades, they come back. I first learned about my family's connection to the Sawyer's Gap incident when I was 12 years old. My grandfather sat me down and told me the story, a sanitized version, leaving out the worst details. He made me promise never to go to that hollow, never to even drive through Breathitt County if I could avoid it. I thought he was being melodramatic, the way old people sometimes are about family history. Then he showed me the photographs. In 1957, a team of geologists from the University of Kentucky conducted a survey of Breathitt County, looking for potential mining sites. They took core samples from several locations, including one about 50 feet from where Silas's well had been. The core sample from that location showed something impossible. At a depth of 73 feet, they hit a void, a cavity, and the walls of that void showed clear evidence of the same crystalline substance Silas had described. But here's the kicker. The void wasn't natural. It was new. The rock layers showed recent disturbance, as if something had excavated the space from below within the past few decades. The geologists recommended that area be declared unstable and unsuitable for any kind of development. My grandfather had copies of those geological reports because he'd been obsessed with understanding what happened to his grandfather. He'd spent 30 years researching the case, talking to old-timers who remembered the incident, digging through county records and newspaper archives, and he discovered something that terrified him. Every 20 to 30 years there are reports from Sawyer's Gap of underground sounds, earth subsidence, and unexplained disappearances. 1927, a hunting party of 3 men vanished after camping in the hollow. Their camp was found intact, but there were signs of a struggle and strange marks in the earth leading toward the location of Silas's sealed well. 1953, a family attempting to rebuild Dutch Sawyer's old cabin reported persistent underground drumming and abandoned the project after their daughter disappeared for 3 days. She was found wandering in the woods, unable to speak and with no memory of what had happened. She never fully recovered and spent the rest of her life in an institution. 1979, a group of spelunkers exploring the area discovered a new sinkhole had opened about 100 yards from the old well site. They descended 30 feet before fleeing in terror, claiming they'd heard voices and seen movement in passages that led deeper. The sinkhole was officially sealed by the county within a week. And here's where this story, Gene Peeb, tension personal. In 2003, I ignored my grandfather's warnings. I was 25, armed with all the arrogance of a graduate degree in geology, and I was convinced there had to be a rational explanation for the Sawyer's Gap phenomenon. I thought maybe there was an underground river causing subsidence, or perhaps unusual mineral deposits creating acoustic effects, or some other mundane solution that would finally put my family's superstitious fears to rest. I drove out to Breathitt County in October, the same month Silas had dug his well a century earlier. I hiked into Sawyer's Gap with ground pine, trading radar equipment borrowed from my university. I was going to solve this mystery with science and put an end to 4 generations of nightmares. I set up my equipment at dawn on October 6th, 2003, exactly 102 years after Silas made his final descent. The GPR readings were immediately strange. He ground beneath that hollow is riddled with voids and cavities, creating a 3-dimensional maze of empty spaces that extends down at least 300 feet, the limit of my equipment's range. But the voids aren't random. They form a pattern, a structure, spiraling down in a way that's too regular, or to be natural. And they're growing. Comparing my readings to the 1957 core sample data, I could see that the void spaces had expanded significantly. Whatever is down there is still excavating, still digging, still working its way toward the surface. But the readings weren't what made me pack up my equipment and run. What broke me was the sound. It started around 3 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to lower toward the western ridges. A low vibration, so deep it was more felt than heard, rising from the ground beneath my feet. Then it resolved into that pattern Silas had described. 3 bagd, eats, pause, 5 beats, pause, 3 beats, over and over. And then, as I stood there, frozen in terror, the pattern changed. It became 3 beats, pause, 5 beats, pause, or 8 beats. My initials are JEW, James Edward Webb. 3 letters, 5 letters, 4 letters. It knew my name. Or it Endel. Oh, I was there, and it was counting me. I ran. I left $20,000 of borrowed equipment, and I ran back to my car, and I drove straight through to Tennessee without stopping. I never went back. I never wrote the paper I'd planned. I told my department chair the equipment had been destroyed. In an accident. Paid for it out of my own savings over the next 3 years, and I never spoke about what happened. But I've continued researching the phenomenon from a safe distance, and what I've learned has convinced me that Silas was right about one thing. Something is down there. Something, eld and patient and vast. And every few decades it digs a little closer to the surface. Here's what I think is actually happening, based on evidence from multiple disciplines: geology, biology, iology, and yes, even the folkloric knowledge that people like Mary Sixkiller try to pass down. Mind, the Appalachian mountains are old, not just old by human standards. They're older than bones, older than trees, older than almost anything else on the North American continent. They were tall when the dinosaurs walked, and they've been eroding ever since, wearing down from peaks that once rivaled the Himalayas to the ancient, rounded mountains we see today. But erosion works both ways. As the surface wears down, spaces open up below. Water dissolves limestone, creating caves. Tectonic shifts create fissures and voids, and over millions of years, those spaces become interconnected, forming vast underground systems that we've barely begun to map. Now here's where it gets speculative, but stay with me. What if something lives in those deep places? Not lives like we understand life, not eating and breathing and reproducing in the ways we're familiar with, but something that exists in the slow time of geology, that thinks in epochs rather than seconds, that builds and plans and waits over timescales that make human civilization look like a brief flicker. There's precedent for this kind of life. We found bacteria living in rock formations 2 miles underground, organisms that have been isolated from the surface world for millions of years, metabolizing minerals and dividing once every 1,000 years. We've discovered entire ecosystems in deep ocean trenches, living around thermal vents in conditions we once thought incompatible with life. Why not something in the deep Appalachia, in caverns? Something that evolved there, that adapted to that environment, that became something we have no framework to understand? And what if that something is intelligent? Not intelligent like us, but intelligent in its own way, with its own goals and methods and timescales. What if the structure Silas found weren't built for us, but simply existed long before us, and occasionally, very occasionally, the boundary between their world and ours becomes thin enough that contact is possible? This is the part where I sound crazy, I know. But consider the evidence. Multiple independent witnesses, ascribing the same phenomena across a century. Physical evidence of the cavities in the crystalline substance. Documented disappearances and acoustic anomalies that defy conventional explanation. And the pattern, that consistent 20 to 30-year cycle of activity that suggests something regular, something rhythmic, something almost intentional. I think whatever is down there becomes aware of the surface world periodically. Maybe it's tied to geological cycles we don't understand, or solar activity, or some other natural rhythm, and when it becomes aware of us, it reaches up, testing, probing, trying to understand what walks above its domain. And I think Silas gave it something it had never had before. A direct path to the surface. A human-made tunnel that breached their territory and created a two-way passage. We dug down to them, and now they dig up to us. The question that ants me is, what happens when they finally break through? Because make no mistake, they're getting closer. The 2003 GPR data showed voids within 50 feet of the surface. Local reports from the last decade indicate increasing sinkhole activity in Sawyer's Gap. And in 2019, a hiker reported finding a perfectly circular depression in the ground that had appeared overnight, approximately 60 feet across and 20 feet deep, right where Silas's well used to be. The county sealed it with concrete within 48 hours. No official report was filed. The area is now fenced off as a geological haze, ARD zone, and no trespassing signs have been posted throughout the hollow. But you can still hear the sounds if you go there at the right time. Every October, particularly in the first 2 weeks of the month, the vibrations return. Local animals avoid the area. Plants grow stunted and twisted in a quarter-mile radius of the old well site. And if you're foolish enough to camp there overnight, which I absolutely do not recommend, you'll hear them. 3 beats, 5 beats, variable beats. They're counting, or communicating, or warning us. Maybe all 3. Here's what troubles me most, this case from an educational perspective. Silas Webb was not stupid. He was educated, rational, scientific in his approach. But he made a fundamental error that a lot of educated people make. He assumed that knowledge and understanding are the same thing as wisdom. He assumed that because he could measure and document and categorize what he found, that meant he should. The people who warned him, Mary Sixkiller, the neighbors, even Sheriff Watts after he visited the site, they had wisdom that Silas lacked. They understood that there are boundaries in nature that exist for good reasons, that doors should stay closed, that not every mystery needs to be solved. This is something we've lost in modern culture, particularly in Western scientific culture. We've become so focused on the idea that knowledge is always good, that understanding is always worth pursuing, that we've forgotten old wisdom about forbidden knowledge, about things that humanity is better off not knowing. I'm not advocating for ignorance. I'm not saying we should abandon scientific inquiry, but I am saying that maybe, just maybe, our ancestors who marked certain places as taboo, who created stories about areas to avoid and depths not to plumb, they weren't just being superstitious. They were passing down hard-won wisdom about the genuine dangers that exist in the world. The Appalachian people knew about the deep places. They knew there were hollows you didn't settle, wells you didn't dig, caves you did not explore. They passed this knowledge down through stories and warnings, and sometimes just a feeling of unease that kept them away from certain areas. When outsiders like Silas came in with their education and their confidence and their dismissal of local superstition, they often paid a terrible price for their arrogance. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout history and across cultures. Indigenous peoples have knowledge about their environments that takes generations to accumulate. Knowledge about what plants are safe, what animals are dangerous, what places should be avoided. And time again, colonizers and developers and scientists have dismissed this knowledge as primitive ignorance, only to discover too late that the warnings were accurate. So what's the takeaway here? What's the lesson from Silas Webb's tragic story? First, humility. Approach the unknown with respect rather than arrogance. Just because you have education and tools doesn't mean you understand everything. The universe is vastly stranger than our frameworks can accommodate, and there are genuine mysteries that we may not be equipped to handle. Second, listen to local knowledge. The people who've lived in an area for generations often know things that aren't written in any textbook. Their warnings come from real experience, real observation, real wisdom. Dismissing it as superstition is both disrespectful and dangerous. Third, some doors should stay closed. Not every cave needs to be explored. Not every depth needs to be plumbed. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Sometimes the wise choice is to acknowledge that something is beyond our understanding and leave it alone. And fourth, and this is the one that really matters, we are not the masters of this planet. We're recent arrivals, sharing space with life forms and geological processes, and who knows what else that were here long before us and will be here long after we're gone. The deep places, the wild places, the ancient places, they belong to themselves. We're guests here, and we should act like it. Now I know if you were thinking, but this is all speculation. Maybe there's a mundane explanation. Maybe Silas just fell into an underground river and drowned, and everything else is coincidence and hysteria. Maybe. I used to think that too. I wanted to think that. But I've read every document. I've interviewed descendants of everyone involved. I've studied the geological surveys and the newspaper accounts and the official reports. And most importantly, I've been there. I've stood on that ground and felt what's underneath it. Something is down there. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's alive, in any sense we'd recognize. I don't know if it's intelligent or simply operating on some kind of instinctive behavior we don't understand. But I know it's there, and I know it's aware of us, and I know that every time someone digs in that hollow, they make it easier for whatever it is to reach the surface. The sealed well site is still there, marked now with official warnings and fencing, but the ground around it continues to subside. New sinkholes appear and are sealed. The vibrations continue on their regular cycle, and every few years someone ignores the warnings and goes into that hole. And some of them don't come out. In 2017, a YouTube urban explorer disappeared while filming in Sawyer's Gap. His camera was found a week later at the bottom of a sinkhole that hadn't existed when he entered the area. The last footage on the camera shows him descending into the hole with a flashlight, excited about finding some kind of tunnel and commenting on weird sounds he can hear from below. The video cuts off suddenly, but the audio continues for another 3 minutes, and what's recorded in those 3 minutes has never been released to the public. The official explanation is equipment malfunction, but I've talked to the sheriff's deputy who reviewed the footage. He won't describe what's on the audio, but he's refused to go anywhere near Sawyer's Gap since then. The hollow is still there. The thing beneath it is still there, and someday Maybe in my lifetime, maybe in my children's lifetime, it's going to break through. When it does, I hope someone has the sense to do what Silas Webb should have done in September of 1901, seal it, walk away, and never look back. But I doubt they will. Because we're curious creatures, we humans. We see a hole in the ground and we want to know what's at the bottom. We hear strange sounds and we want to investigate. We're told something is dangerous and we want to prove we're smart enough or brave enough or special enough to handle it. That's what killed Silas Webb, not the thing in the deep. At least not directly. His own curiosity killed him. His inability to walk away from a mystery, his conviction that understanding was worth any risk, his arrogance in thinking he could control forces he didn't comprehend. And that's what will kill the next person who digs in Sawyer's Gap, and the next one after that. Because the thing about humans is that we never learn. We repeat the same mistakes across generations, each time convinced that we're different, that we're smarter, that we'll be the one to solve the mystery and emerge triumphant. Silas thought that too. His journal makes it clear he believed he was on the verge of a discovery that would revolutionize archaeology and geology. He thought he'd be famous, respected, vindicated for his willingness to pursue knowledge wherever it led. Instead, he vanished into a hole in the ground in Kentucky, and all he left behind was a warning that nobody heeded. I'm telling this story now because I'm 62 years old, and I won't be around forever. My grandfather's research and Silas's journal will eventually end up in some archive where they'll gather dust, and the knowledge of what happened at Sawyer's Gap will fade into just another Appalachian ghost story. I want there to be a record, a clear account, something that anyone researching this in the future can find. If you're reading this and you're thinking about investigating Sawyer's Gap yourself, please don't. I know how curiosity works. I know how compelling a good mystery can be. But trust me, can I tell you, this is one mystery that should remain unsolved. The thing in the deep is patient. It's been there for longer than we can imagine, and it will be there long after we're gone. It doesn't need us to understand it. It doesn't need us to document it or study it or validate its existence. It simply is, down there in the darkness, in the cold, in spaces so deep that human concepts like time and meaning lose their coherence. Leave it alone. Let it dig in peace. Don't give it another path to the surface, because someday, if we're not careful, we won't be the ones doing the digging. We'll be the ones being dug toward. And when that day comes, when whatever lives in the deep places of Appalachia finally breaks through to our world, we'll discover what Silas Webb learned too late, that there are things in this earth older and stranger than we ever imagined, and some of them have been waiting a very long time for their turn at the surface. The well was dug in 1901. Something dug back, and it's still digging, even now. Even as you read this, listen carefully next time you're in the mountains. Put your ear to the ground in a quiet hollow. You might hear it, that distant, rhythmic sound, like something enormous and patient, working its way slowly upward through stone and earth and time. 3 beats, 5 beats, variable beats. It's counting something. Maybe years, maybe victims, maybe the remaining distance to the surface. Whatever it's counting, the number is getting smaller. Silas Webb opened a door that day in September of 1901. The question that keeps me awake at night is simple and terrible. When that door finally opens all the way, what's going to walk through? I don't want to know. And if you're smart, neither do you. Stay away from Sawyer's Gap. Stay away from the old hollow. And for God's sake, if you're ever in Breathitt County, Kentucky, and you feel the ground vibrating beneath your feet in that familiar pattern, 3 beats, 5 beats, 3 beats, run. Don't investigate. Don't wonder. Don't try to understand. Just run. Because the fifth thing about digging is that you never really know what's listening from below. Until it's too late.